doing great.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Made Known. I'm your host, Tyler Crawford, and with me, as always, is Mr. Manny Longfoot. How's it going, Manny?
It's going pretty good.
You had a good week?
It's been all right. It's been busy.
Yeah, I've been pretty busy, too, and some good long hours at work.
It's always good.
But what are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to continue last week's discussion, in which last week we discussed a couple things. We discussed sex, right?
Yep.
Spouses, don't deprive each other, fulfill your marital duties. We discussed remarriage, and we also discussed divorce, right? So one of the issues that might have been happening at Corinth was wanting to leave an unbeliever to marry a believer, and Paul saying, hey, don't do that because the unbelieving spouse might be saved through you, but if they leave, they take full responsibility.
Right.
And so today we're kind of continue on that tread, but he switches to virgins or most or most likely who are most likely engaged individuals,
right,
to ask the question of, well, I've just said that it might be better for someone to stay unmarried so they can serve God, but if they burn with lust, get married. Well, what about those who are already engaged? What do you do there? And so that's kind of where we turn to today.
Absolutely. So we're going to be going through verse 17 through the end of the chapter.
Yep.
So where do we want to start reading? I guess we're going to start with verse 17.
Yeah.
But how far do you want me to read, and then where do you want to pick up?
Wherever you feel froggy.
All right. So
Just read somewhere, stop.
all right. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Rather, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. I suppose, therefore, that it is good, because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you.
All right, verse 29, what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is considered about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Big old chunk.
Yes. Luckily, it's fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of verses, but it's not very confusing.
Right.
We can see what he's talking about. So let's dig in. Go for it.
Okay. Verse 17. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned them, just as God called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. And I'll stop there, and then we can go verse 18 through 20 in a moment. You can work for the Lord in whatever situation you became a Christian in. All right. You don't have to, if you get saved, you don't have to leave the country the next day to serve God. You can serve him in your own neighborhood. You can serve him wherever you are. And that's kind of Paul's point. And he makes that point a couple times throughout this, is the idea is bloom where you're planted. Wherever God called you, he can use you. And so don't think that you have to just go out somewhere to be used. You can be used wherever you are.
Right. If you think about terms of evangelism, when you think about an evangelist, most of the time you think about people traveling all over the world, or the guys that drive around in a van from city to city preaching the word, which is a great thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get me wrong. Somebody's called to that. That is great. Do the work of the Lord in that way. But what Paul's saying here is that's not what everybody's called to do. Especially if you're called as a slave, which we'll get to in a minute. It's not like you have a lot of freedom of movement. And if you go to the book of Philemon, where Paul sends a slave back to his master and says, that's where you're supposed to be, but also, master, you need to accept him as your brother in Christ, not as a servant. So it's important that you do have liberty to work in every area that you are. It's easy to get discouraged where you are. You don't feel like you're moving in the right direction, or, man, I really want to do this, or I want something else. And what Paul is telling us here is that just minister to people where you are, where you can, okay? There are unbelievers all around you. And so it may be work to try and find somebody and talk to them, because a lot of times if you're in the whole Christian world, you may not have a lot of friends of unbelievers. It's possible. So you need to try and work to find those people so that you can have somebody to minister to. That's important. So it's not a sit still and do nothing where you are.
Right.
Where I can just sit here and do my thing. But no, it's about serving the Lord where you are. Right. And that's pretty much, that takes verses 17 through 24. That's kind of that whole block of an overview that we'll jump into it.
Right. And like Tyler said, that doesn't mean that nobody's meant to go evangelize.
Right. Absolutely.
In foreign place. Paul did that. Paul's point is you don't have to do that in order to serve God.
Right.
There's a purpose in everything you're in every situation you're in. You don't have to change that situation to serve God. So anyway, verse 18 through 20.
Yeah, go for it.
Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not become circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Same thing we were sorry, my eyes are burning. My contacts are getting a little dry.
Yeah.
Same thing we're talking about. One thing Paul might be playing off here is, for the Gentiles, circumcision is mutilation.
Right.
For the Jews, it's a covenant command.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could have two possibilities, or both. You could have Jews, which you see in the book of Acts, and also Paul has to confront Peter for, and some others in the book of Galatians, who are badgering the Gentiles into being circumcised.
Right.
Or you also have situations in the ancient world of Gentiles mocking Jews for body mutilation, and some Jews would go and get a surgery to try and reverse the circumcision.
Oof. I was about to say, I didn't know you could get uncircumcised. I thought that was pretty
well, and
pretty permanent.
He may just be using it for the point of, you don't have to do this to serve God.
Right.
But that he may also be having that in mind, because that's, in a cosmopolitan church, a very possible situation.
Yeah. You don't have to drop your Jewishness.
Right.
Right. The early church was filled with Jewish converts and Gentile converts that were mingling together in a way that they never would have before.
Right.
The Jews kept to themselves, and the Gentiles, they might do business with them, that they weren't in close fellowship, right? Those were those weird people that did those weird things. We're really not going to have anything to do with those people.
Talking circumcision, you make me cry.
Yeah. So anyhow, if you are called while circumcised or a Jew, you don't have to drop your Jewishness, right? You can still do those things. You've got your culture that's not necessarily bad. You just have to follow Christ and trust in Him for His work.
And likewise, you don't have to become a Jew.
Right.
Or a Gentile.
Exactly. So if you're uncircumcised or Gentiles, you don't have to convert. Because, again, in Galatians, that's really the heresy that's being taught to them.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether you're Jew or Greek. And so we'll just go to Galatians. Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 through 29. And it says, "For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." Basically the same kind of point.
Right. And of course, I guess I can make a further note here without trying to pick on anybody. But he follows up the circumcision talk by saying, keeping God's commands is what counts. So, circumcision can't be one of those commands. If that's the contrast, not trying to make any groups upset, but there are a couple groups that might not like that a lot. But yeah, keeping God's commands is what counts, not circumcision. So, and in, of course, Galatians, being justified by faith and not through the works of the law is what counts. And then, of course, from that, you do works.
Right. And then he goes on to say in Galatians, if you are circumcised and you're doing that for justification, right?
Just lob it all off.
Lob it all off, or you're held accountable to the whole law.
Right.
And that's the thing we don't want to get into. Because if I'm accountable to the whole law, I'm done for.
Right. So what Paul's not saying is that keeping aspects of the law is a problem. What Paul is saying is that keeping aspects of the law, thinking you have to keep the law and not keeping the whole law, is a problem. If you want to keep aspects of the law and you recognize it has nothing to do with your salvation, go for it. Do it. It's fine. If you want to keep the law because you think it contributes or is necessary for your salvation, then you slip up in the law. That's a whole other problem.
Right. And the law is a heavy master.
Right.
So if you want to subject yourself to that, be careful. That's all I'm going to say. Yeah. Verse 21.
Mm-hmm. You have to probably read 21 through 23.
Sure. "Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men." That's 23.
Go ahead and read 24.
"Brethren, let each one remain with God in the state in which he was called."
Okay. So even slaves in a not so nice situation can still serve God in the situation they're in. And one of the great things about that for them is, which Paul tells them, if you can be free, do it, which slaves could be free in this scenario. And there's really probably two different slaves in mind. One would be the slavery like we did, not so good.
Not we.
Yeah.
Not we.
Yeah, well, not, yeah, personally not.
Historical United States.
The
And the rest of
other
the
would
world.
be indentured servitude, where you owe someone money and you become almost like a job, but you're kind of, until you get it paid off, or, well, in Leviticus, till the year of Jubilee rolls around, you're in debt.
Which you don't want to start that the year after Jubilee, because you're going to have a long wait.
You're going to have 7 stinking
Yeah,
years.
you have a long wait.
But the slaves should rejoice in the fact that even if they can't get their freedom, they become a slave. Which one way a slave could become free, depending on what temple they belong to, was by doing side jobs, bringing money to the temple, saving it up there, and eventually they could buy their own freedom. Right. But yeah, they should rejoice in the fact that they're free in Christ one way or another. If they get their free, there's freedom, great. If they can't, they can still serve God where they are because they're free in Christ. And more importantly, they're a slave to Christ. And then, of course, he contrasts in verse 23, you being bought at a price with like a slave being bought, and so you don't become a slave.
Right. You belong to Christ.
Right.
And so it also gives the if you are come to Christ as a slave, you're Christ's freedman, right? You have liberty in Christ, and he has set you free from your sin and iniquity, but also bringing the person that might be kind of stuck up, that comes as a freed person, looks down on their other little slaves. He's like, no, you don't need to be that proud of yourself. You're a slave to Christ.
Right.
Paul calls himself a bondservant of Christ over and over and over again in his letters. That means something. Even if it's willing servitude, it's still subjection and submissiveness to the Lord. And submission is not a word that we like very much. Western culture, especially here in America, is I've got my rights. I don't submit to nobody.
And Scripture uses the word quite frequently.
Yes. So when it comes to submission, we're not only to submit ourselves, but our will and everything about us to Christ and what he's commanded.
Right. If you think about this like indentured servitude, there's a reason Proverbs 22 says the borrower is slave to the lender. Don't owe people money.
That's a
Probably
good
not
point.
a good idea.
I just took out a
I didn't mean-
$200,000
I didn't
loan
mean
on a
to go-
house, so
I'm gonna send you some Dave Ramsey videos of this.
he said it's okay if it's on a house. I don't bow before the altar of Dave Ramsey. Just throwing that out there. Anyhow, let's
Didn't even know he had an altar.
self-made. Not by me. Radio
Verse
people.
25.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have anything else to say? No, we're talking about Dave Ramsey.
No, that's what I had. Yeah.
Okay, verse 25. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is.
We talked about this, a little bit last week, that if you're not and you can serve the Lord and keep your carnality and lust and your you have complete willpower and do not struggle with that kind of stuff.
Forcing yourself to stay single.
Right. Then by all means, that is a good thing. And he's going to go into the reasons why in a little bit. But
right. And this is, as you'll notice, he says in verse 26, because of the present crisis, I think it is good for a man to remain as he is. So Paul is addressing a situation.
Right.
So for instance, in 1 Timothy 5, Paul actually instructs the widows to marry, the young widows to marry. But one of the reasons is there's false teachers in the church forbidding marriage. In this scenario, it's a little bit different. Paul's saying if you marry, for whatever the situation is, and it might have to do with Rome or whatever's going on, they are in Rome, it's going to make your life difficult. And Paul, of course, says, it goes on to say, I'm trying to spare you.
Yeah.
And so he's dealing with a specific situation. This is not necessarily his advice for every individual. So.
Yeah. We'll keep going.
Yeah. Verse 27, are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Or probably a better way to understand that, as like the New King James says, are you bound to a wife? Correct. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life. And I want to spare you. So we talked about divorce and remarriage a little bit last week. But Paul's saying, if you're married, well, I guess it depends on how you understand this. I guess we could have done a little bit of work on what was a better way to understand this, whether it had to do with engagement or actually being married.
Yeah.
But Paul's saying if you're married, stay that way. But if you're a widow or a widower, probably whatever crisis is going on might be easier on you if you don't remarry. With the exception, of course, as he's already stated earlier in the chapters, if you're going to burn with lust, it's going to be better for you to remarry.
Right.
And of course, he also specifies, though, that if you do remarry, you're not sinning. It's not an issue of sin. It's an issue of Paul wants to spare them of trouble.
Right. It's solid advice, especially in the time in which they're living.
Right.
He's not saying, I command you to do this by the Lord.
Right. He actually says, I have no command from the Lord.
Exactly.
25.
So basically, he's saying this is some good advice for you Corinthians here, and it's advice that we can take hold of.
Yeah.
And we can look at it and be like, is this going to be best for me? Is this not? And it's like, yeah, go. You're not going to sin.
Right. I mean, last week you used John Wesley as an example. Which is a good example. It's like John Wesley, if he had fulfilled his marital duties to his wife, which he should have, he wouldn't have been able, which is Paul's concern here, he wouldn't have been able to serve the Lord in the same way he did.
Right.
And so if you can avoid that situation, right, because ultimately it's a sin for him not to fulfill his marital duties like he should have. He should have never married, which you said last week, and he would have been able to serve the Lord in this situation better.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it
without
can be.
hurting a woman for no reason.
Yeah. If you don't, Paul's also will go on to say here in a little bit, you don't have to marry.
Yeah.
Like, you are not being forced to marry. If you don't marry, it's not a sin. In fact, you may be able to fully devote yourself more to the Lord. But if you do marry, it's also not a sin. In fact, Paul actually specified earlier in the chapter that both marriage and singleness were gifts from God. The ability to do either one is a gift from God.
And as he said before, walk as you are.
Right.
So continue on. There you go. Can we keep reading?
Yeah, go for it.
But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as those they did not possess. And those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away.
Okay. What do you think he means by the time is short?
Well, you could always go to the really new doctrine of the rapture, which is only about 130, 140 years old.
Pre-trib rapture is about 130 years old. Rapture is a little bit older than that.
Right. So
Yeah.
pre-trib.
The word, well, here we go. Here we
Go
go.
for it.
The word actually comes from the Latin Vulgate, which the word means to be called up. So the term itself is biblical. The question is, are the views of the rapture biblical?
Right.
Probably not.
What do you think it means?
Well, if nothing else, let me go on how I would apply it more than, because I can't say I exactly know what he means by that. Some scholars would say there's a lot of scholars that would say Paul believed Christ would return at his time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I would agree with that or not. Maybe he speculates about it, but one way or another, live with a sense of urgency.
Right.
Right. There he goes. He says, those who buy something as if they were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in it. The idea is this stuff is temporary.
Mm-hmm.
Live in a sense of urgency because Christ's kingdom is eternal.
Right.
So that's how I would apply it.
I've heard a lot of people say that are like from the other perspective,
Mhm.
from like the short-term pre-trib, looking for Christ at every corner. And they'll say, you shouldn't live like that. We've been on the church for 2,000 years, and you're doing a disservice to the church, because if you think that the Lord's coming back any day now, why would you build hospitals? Why would you build orphanages? Why would you do all those things?
Mm.
I've heard it. Anyhow.
Paul had an urgency to get to Spain. Right?
Yes, he did.
Spain at that time was the end of the earth, and Paul said, I'm getting to the end of the earth with
Absolutely.
the gospel.
So again, thanks for looking at my notes. No, not really, but that's where I was going with it, is that basically there's people that say, we don't know when Christ is coming back. It could be another 2,000 years, so live like that. And I'm saying Jesus could come back at any time. You need to be very heavenly minded in spreading the gospel. Yes, we want to do good things and give to the poor and all that kind of stuff. But you know what's more important than giving money to poor people? Is sharing the gospel to save souls. Okay? So I am going to live like Christ could come back at any point, because he could.
Right.
It could be tomorrow. Could it be 100 or 1,000 years? Maybe. I'm not trying to speculate on end times, because one, we've lived in the end times since Christ went up. We don't know when it's going to be. And it could be tomorrow, or it could be a long time.
Right.
So I want to keep my eyes open. But the biggest thing to keep our eyes open is not so that we can buckle down and prepare for the tribulation when it comes. Because you've got the two kind of people. You've got the people that are all, we're not going to do any of that because the Lord's coming back and we're going to be raptured up before it gets bad. Then you've got the people, we're going to be here the whole time, and I've got a bunker out in the back for whenever they drop nukes. You know, listen, I'm in the South. I've heard a lot of
You want me to
different.
upset everybody?
Go for it, please. I do.
When it says 2 are in the field and 1 will be taken, the one taken is the one you don't want to be. Where the buzzards are. Yeah, the one taken. He prefaces it with the flood. The ones taken are those who are swept away by the flood, and then goes into a number of analogies that you don't want to be the ones taken.
Right.
Just saying.
So you want to live with the urgency of spreading the gospel.
Right. And Paul says at the end of verse 31, for this world in its present form is passing away. So you're not going to have this stuff forever. It's passing away. So you do want to live with a sense of urgency.
And you do want to share the gospel with anybody who
Right.
will listen, especially if you think that it matters.
Right.
Hit on my old Calvinist
Hopefully
buddies
you do.
here. Right? Hit on my old Calvinist buddies here that, if you're elect, you're going to have 100% success rate for all those who are supposed to come to Christ.
Okay. Well, that's not really fair. Most Calvinists would still believe it.
They would.
100% evangelism.
I know, but
even if it's inconsistent.
I know. I just saw that clip from Jeff Durbin, though. And that's what he
did you?
said. Jeff Durbin, he was like, 100% success rate with evangelism.
Yeah, I think every Calvinist that John Owens said 100% success rate.
Yeah. So
which,
still.
to be fair, you'd had 100% success rate if you never did it. But
Here
do
or
it.
there. Do it. Even if you think it doesn't matter,
No,
because it
it
does. Because if you think that you have an impact and what you do actually matters in spreading the gospel, and that people could be dying and going to hell, so you need to do something about it. Why else would Paul want to get to Spain? So that people could be
Food's good.
saved.
Oh, yeah, and that too.
I've never. Yeah. Okay. Continue.
Okay, where are we?
I don't
Verse
know.
32. We have been on some serious rabbit trails today.
We have, but
Dave Ramsey, pre-trib rapture, Calvinism.
But this is so straightforward. You've got to do some eisegesis. That's a joke. Please don't.
It'd be interesting that you pull that up right after Calvinism.
I know.
Anyway, okay. Verse 32. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. I'm over here hiccuping like you are.
Yeah.
Right, so just continuing his thought. If you stay single, you may be able to devote yourself more fully to God. It's not a sin to get married, but it can save you trouble. And it can also allow you the opportunity to, because you have duties. Paul has already assured the Corinthians they have duties to their spouses. When they wanted to not fulfill them in verse 1 of chapter 7, Paul says, no, it's too late for that. You're married. You need to fulfill your duties to your spouse. All of them. Right? And Paul is saying here, if you don't get married, right, bloom where you planted. And if you don't get married, you can really bloom where you planted. Right? So...
And it's true. When you have a wife, or ladies, if you have a husband, you do have to take care of your spouse, and you want to do that.
And it's a good thing to do.
It is. And not only, in one, Christ gave us marriage, and it's sanctifying, and it's good. But yeah, your things you do have a mixed focus. Like, I want to spread the gospel with everything I've got, and now I've got to pay for a house. So that means I've got to work longer and do more things so that not only do I keep a roof over my family's head and keep food on the table, but then also take care of my wife. And that limits me because it's supposed to, right? Neither of them is a bad thing. It is a great and wholesome thing to have a family and take care of them.
Right.
That's a great thing, and I love it. And I wouldn't want it any other way.
But interests become divided.
Yes.
Right. So, good?
Good.
Okay. And once again, like Paul says in verse 35, I am saying this for your own good. He's already said in verse 26, because of the present crisis, it is good for a man to remain as he is. And then he says, I'm doing this for your own good. It's not to restrict you. It's okay if you get married. But he's trying to help them to avoid problems. Right. So.
It's not like putting a dog on a leash saying you can't go here or there.
Right.
Right. That's
Right.
not the point.
He's concerned about them and the problems they might face if they do get married. So.
Fair.
Right. Verse 36.
That's good. 36. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and has so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well.
So there's actually a debate over the virgin here, right? So, for instance, an alternative reading to verse 36, it says, if anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. An alternate reading is, if anyone thinks he is not treating his daughter properly, and if she is getting along in years, or her passions are too strong and he feels she ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. Decently significant.
Yeah.
One of them, she's old. The other one, she's engaged. So principle could be the same one way or another, though. Right. If you're engaged, you don't have to you don't have to break off. Once again, bloom where you're planted. Yeah. You can serve in that situation. You're not sinning if you marry her. But using John Wesley's example, he shouldn't have married. And that's the person. If you made it up, you're fine. You can get along without marrying. Don't. And if it's, of course, it's a father and daughter, and the daughter's struggling, well, don't increase her struggle. Yeah. You don't keep her from marrying so that she can serve the Lord, nuns, and increase her struggle. Right. So you don't put a stumbling block in her path.
Yeah. Again, I know a lot of this is very straightforward, so this is not going to be the longest episode we've ever done, and that's okay with me. I hope it's okay with all of you. Let's go through the last bit. 38. So then, he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment. And I think I also have the Spirit of God.
Right. So, women, don't be divorcing your husbands. Men, don't be divorcing your wives. But if he dies or she dies, free to marry, as long as you marry a believer. Which is probably good advice for someone who hasn't been married anyways.
Very good advice.
To marry a believer.
Yeah.
But yeah.
You'll open yourself up to a world of trouble if you don't. If you think marriage is hard when both of you are believers, try throwing one that's not a believer in the mix. Which is why earlier in the chapter when he says, if your husband will put up with you, stay with him and maybe you'll get saved. And vice versa.
Right.
So, yeah, it's going to be hard if that's the way it shakes out.
But Paul says, in my judgment, she's happier if she stays as she is, and I too think I have the Spirit of God. In other words, Paul is saying, I'm not commanding this, but this is a wise choice. I'm not just giving you just some random thought. I'm guided by God's Spirit here.
Yeah.
So.
Closing thoughts.
You can serve God wherever you are. You don't have to get a divorce to serve God. You don't have to get married to serve God. You don't have to go get a new job to serve God. You can serve Him where you are. You should serve Him where you are. And if you're married, don't seek to be loosed. If you're not married and you have no reason to be married, and you can serve God better if you're not married, don't get married.
There you go. And if you say, I've got to have a new job before I can serve God, I've got to get married before I serve God, or I've got to get divorced before I serve God, that sounds like a bunch of excuses that you need to quit whining about and go to work. Okay? They're excuses. Yeah. We are very good as people at finding excuses to do the things we may not really want to do, or the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, and if I can get this one thing, then maybe I'll be happy, or maybe I can serve God better, or maybe I can do this or do that. That's a load of bovine scatology, to put it nicely. Don't make excuses. serve God where you are, and be zealous about spreading the gospel with an urgency, because this earth is passing away. Your stuff is going to burn up. You're going to go into the grave naked even if you got clothes on. Job said, naked I came into this world, and naked I shall leave it. I ain't never seen a trailer behind a hearse. Right? The old joke goes, is this guy, he died, and he told his wife before he died, he said, put all my gold in my casket with me, and so I can take it up to heaven. Dude comes walking up to heaven, and he's got this sack of gold on his back, and St. Peter says, why'd you bring pavement? Streets of gold. And just one more to give you two. This guy, he was about to die. He told his wife,
extend the time here.
I am. He told his wife to put all of his money in the attic. So she did. He died, and she forgot about it. A few months later, she's like, I wonder if it's still up there. So she goes up, and all his money's still in the attic. And she's like, I knew I should have put it in the basement. Ta-da! There you go.
Chapter recap. Do not deprive your spouses because you will lead them into sexual immorality. Don't do that. You don't want to lead your spouse or put them in a scenario where they're open to sexual immorality. Fulfill your marital duties. If you've gotten divorced, you can remarry a believer if you've been properly divorced. If you have been divorced improperly, try and reconcile your divorce. Bloom where you planted. If you're a slave, get your freedom. You're a slave to Christ, though. And, yeah. That's it.
That's all I've got. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to hit the like, share, follow, and comment.
There you go.
We would love to see your comments, interact with you in any way. Thanks for tuning in. We love you. Tell somebody about Jesus. Bye-bye.